Ever met someone who hasn't heard the Titanic story? Probably not. Even a 9-year-old could tell you what sank the massive ship. But some survivors might disagree with that version. So, was it really an iceberg that sank the Titanic? Here's some of the survivor stories, and spoiler alert, it doesn't involve an iceberg. Before we dive into the story of a Titanic survivor who questions whether an iceberg actually sank the ship, let's first break down the widely accepted tale of the iceberg itself. When you think about it, the iceberg that collided with the Titanic had its own epic journey long before it ever reached the fateful spot in the North Atlantic. It all starts with snow. When snow falls, it's like a chain reaction. Tiny dust particles form crystals, which collect more crystals until they grow into snowflakes. These snowflakes, with their iconic six-sided shapes, fall and accumulate in places like Greenland, where they get compressed into dense glacial ice over thousands of years. For the iceberg that met the Titanic, it began as snow around 15,000 years ago on Greenland's ice sheets. Over time, it moved slowly toward the coast, breaking off into the ocean to become a massive iceberg. By the summer of 1909, this iceberg had drifted away from Greenland, measuring over 2 miles wide and towering 100 feet above the water, big enough to dwarf famous landmarks like the Colosseum. This iceberg began a slow journey through Arctic waters, following currents that carried it south, where most icebergs eventually melt. But this one lasted longer than most, surviving nearly 3 years. As it drifted into warmer waters in 1912, the iceberg's days were numbered, slowly eroding and flipping as it melted. By the time it reached the shipping lanes at 41 degrees north, on the same path as the Titanic, it was still large enough to pose a serious threat to ships. Icebergs were known dangers at the time, especially in an area nicknamed Iceberg Alley by the U.S. Coast Guard. The Titanic, built for luxury and size, was on its maiden voyage across the Atlantic when it encountered this now famous iceberg. The ship was touted as unsinkable, but 4 days into its journey it struck the iceberg. The rest is history, one of the most famous shipwrecks of all time. But the iceberg was almost at the end of its lifespan, melting and shrinking. If the timing had been different by just a week, a day, or even an hour, the Titanic might have missed it entirely. Yet fate brought them together, forever linking this iceberg to one of the most tragic maritime disasters in history. Now let's talk about a Titanic survivor who questioned whether an iceberg was really to blame for the sinking. Armenian publicist Vaghinak Byurat. He was 25 years old in 1912 and detailed his experience aboard the ship in his memoirs, Back to Vaghinak. In 1912, he had recently published a few books with his father, a well-known Armenian writer, and his task was to bring those books to America. Despite some health issues that initially prevented him from getting the paperwork needed to enter the US, his father managed to pull some strings, and Vaghinak was finally set to make his journey. He took the legendary Orient Express from Istanbul to Le Havre and then made his way to Southampton, where he learned the next ship heading to America was none other than the Titanic, which was the talk of the town. Excited about his voyage, he arrived at the port looking sharp, sporting a trendy cap and massive glasses that were all the rage in the US at the time. He ended up sharing cabin 804 with 3 men, 2 Englishmen and a Frenchman named Morin. Vaghinak and Morin, being close in age and both speaking excellent French, hit it off quickly. The group spent their time hanging out on deck in the ship's saloon and even at the bar and library, never imagining that their unsinkable ship would meet its fate just days later. On the night of April 14th, after staying up late as usual, the peace was shattered shortly after midnight by a loud explosion-like noise. The lights went out, and the Englishmen in the cabin were thrown from their bunks by a violent jolt, injuring one's head and another's arm. The group quickly grabbed a few belongings and left the cabin, unaware they'd never return. Vaghinak only took his passport and $50 in cash. In the corridor, it was eerily quiet, but it soon became clear the ship was sinking. Lifeboats were being readied, but only women and children were allowed to board. Gunshots were even fired to keep some desperate men from sneaking on. With no other option, Vaghinak and Morin, who could both swim well, decided to jump into the freezing water. Morin found them 2 life vests, and Vaghinak secured his passport and money in a small bag tied around his neck, preparing for what came next. As the Titanic's bow dipped deeper into the freezing Atlantic waters, Vaghinak Byurat and his friend Morin faced an unimaginable decision. Staring into the black, icy ocean, they knew their odds of survival were slim, but staying on the ship meant certain death. With heavy hearts and trembling limbs, they took the leap. However, they were instantly separated by a monstrous wave. This sudden loss of companionship made an already terrifying situation even worse. Facing the dark, frigid sea alone, Vaghinak battled the elements, his body numbing with every second in the near-freezing 28-degree Fahrenheit, or Arctic Sea, waters. The icy cold drained his strength, making his arms and legs feel like lead. He soon lost his life vest, leaving him even more vulnerable to the cruel sea. As the minutes dragged on, the reality of his situation must have set in. He was in a vast, freezing ocean, surrounded by chaos and getting weaker with each passing moment. Desperately, he sought a lifeboat, and when he finally found one, it seemed like a beacon of hope. But that hope was short-lived. The lifeboat was already packed with survivors, and the people on board, fearing for their own lives, pushed him away with a paddle. Despite his pleas for mercy, they refused, afraid that one more person would tip the balance and cause them all to drown. Heartbreakingly, Vaghinak had to let go of the lifeboat, plunging back into the icy waters. At this point, any hope of survival seemed to be slipping away. But fate had other plans. Vaghinak later woke up, alive and aboard the Carpathia, the ship that had come to the rescue of Titanic survivors. He had no clear memory of how he ended up there, but his headache and double vision were a small price to pay for his life. Soon, he discovered the reason for his miraculous rescue. Mrs. Astor, a wealthy woman who had lost her husband in the disaster, had spotted Vaghinak in the water and insisted that the lifeboat take him on board. She told the crew he was her son and refused to let them leave without him, saving his life. Mrs. Astor even kept Vaghinak's passport and money safe, offering to help him recover once they reached safety. Upon arriving in New York, Vaghinak was taken to a hospital to recover from his ordeal. His family, waiting anxiously in Boston, was eventually reunited with him, and he even received the books he had been transporting to America, thanks to the fact that they were on a different ship. Vaghinak lived a long and fulfilling life after the Titanic disaster, often sharing his remarkable survival story. However, there was always an intriguing twist to his tale. He never mentioned an iceberg. Instead, Vaghinak consistently described hearing an explosion. According to his version of events, something catastrophic happened deep within the ship, and some survivors reported similar experiences, claiming they heard loud explosions and even saw searchlights from another vessel. These recollections gave rise to several alternate theories about the Titanic's demise. One such theory suggests that a coal fire, which had reportedly started days before the ship's departure, had weakened the hull. Some believe the fire burned slowly in the ship's coal bunkers, critically damaging the structure before it ever met the iceberg. Supporters of this theory point to dark marks on photographs of the Titanic leaving port, indicating the presence of the fire. An even more speculative theory involves a German U-boat. According to this idea, the Titanic might have been struck by a submarine, and some survivors even claimed they saw a searchlight from an unknown vessel shortly after the sinking. Proponents of this theory suggest the U-boat surfaced to observe the damage it had caused. However, there are many reasons why this theory is considered unlikely. First, it was 1912 and the world was not yet at war. The idea of a country deliberately sinking a civilian ship full of passengers would have been unthinkable. Additionally, submarines of that era did not have the range or capabilities to be operating in that region of the Atlantic, and hitting a fast-moving target at night was beyond their technological limits. While it's impossible to know exactly what Vaghinak heard or experienced that night, his account adds to the fascinating and sometimes mysterious lore surrounding the Titanic disaster. Could there have been more to the sinking than the famous iceberg collision? Could a fire or explosion have played a significant role in the ship's demise? What do you think? Let me know your thoughts in the comments. And if you enjoyed this story, don't forget to like and share it with a friend.